The Spin-off Podcast Network.
We believe where you live shouldn't decide your destiny, and that any place can be a place of learning. So much of modern life has a handy home delivery option. Why not your education? Maybe you'll start your degree in the same space you share with your whānau, or from that corner of the spare room that catches the most sun. Start your new what at the place where can be anywhere, online or on campus. Massey, New Zealand's leading online university. Apply now at massey.ac.nz.
Ki te kāhore he whakakitenga ka ngaro te iwi. Without foresight or vision, the people will be lost. Kia ora koutou katoa, I'm Leonie Hayden. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to Conversations That Count, ngā kōrero whaitake, a thought-provoking series brought to you by Massey University and The Spin-off. I'll be your guest host for this episode. Our usual host, Stacey Morrison, will be back for our next instalment. I'm joined today by Selah Hart of Hāpai te Hauora and Dr. Chris Wilkins of Massey University. Together we'll be talking about the upcoming cannabis legalisation and control referendum, examining the arguments for and against its passing and taking a deeper look at a few of the implications were the bill to pass. Who stands to benefit? How would we deal with those convicted or imprisoned prior to legalisation? And which external factors should be taken into account by the process? Selah is the CEO of Hāpai te Hauora, a Māori public health, policy, advocacy and research organisation. He uru no Ngāti Kuia, Ngāti Apa ki te Rātoa, Ngāti Koata, Rangitāne ki Wairau, Ngai Tahu me Ngāti Toia. Selah took up her position in 2019 after more than a decade of working in Māori public health. Chris is the leader of a drug research team at Massey University's Shaw and Whāriki Research Centre and has research expertise in drug trends, drug markets, public health and drug policy. Over the past 20 years, he has completed a number of studies of cannabis use in New Zealand. Tēnā kōrua, Selah, kōrua ko Chris.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
So we've got a new election date. So we're no longer voting on our two referenda on September 19. It's October 17 now. Chris, can you tell us what we're voting on October 17 in this referendum?
So it's voting on the government's cannabis legalisation and control bill, and you can go to the referendum website and take a look at that. And so it's a specific proposal, so we're not voting on just broadly whether to legalise cannabis or not. It's this one or nothing.
And what are your thoughts on that? Should we have gone for decriminalisation first?
I think the reason that they've gone straight for cannabis legalisation is they say, well, you know, if we're going to do this, let's set up a framework and a regime that's going to last for a long time. So we're going to, you know, take the bull by the horns and really try and develop something that's going to be lasting and it's not a halfway measure. Because the downside of just decriminalisation is it's still produced in the black market and all you're doing is letting the user get away with a fine or something. And, you know, I think that kind of, you know, makes sense that you've got to take your window and if you're going to do something, you might as well do something that's sustainable. As a research group, we think it's really important that people can trust the evidence and the analysis that we present, and that's essentially what we've been trying to do, is present evidence that's available from overseas jurisdictions that have already legalised cannabis and our knowledge of drug policy in general. But given it's a referendum and it's a kind of a competition between yes or no, there's been a lot of over-promising from people who are in favour, as well as over-demonisation from people that are negative. It is a really polarised debate and a lot of distrust. So, you know, we recognise that at the end of the day, even though we present all this evidence and, you know, and experience of what's happened overseas, people are going to make their own judgments, you know, based on their own value system about how they see intoxication and risk of dependency and how they think it affects their community, and we respect that. So, you know, reasonable people can disagree on this issue, and at the end of the day, the reason we're having a referendum is because, you know, we're leaving it up to people to decide for themselves.
Kia ora, I respect that. That's very fair. So let's get into what is actually in the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill. So there are going to be stronger restrictions on cannabis than currently exist for tobacco and alcohol. Do you guys think that the restrictions that are in the bill fair or reasonable and will contribute to harm reduction?
Yeah, sure. So from what I understand is that we will have a purchase age limit of 20. So I think that's an encouraging first step. What we see with this current legislation as it's laid out is that that's a great protective mechanism to keep it out of the hands of our rangatahi. Notwithstanding, we know that it is already within the hands of our rangatahi, and so I think that when we're talking about change, it might be a slow movement of change, but I think that it is a great way in which we can ensure that there isn't a free-for-all in regards to purchasing if it was to be made legal. Another thing that we are really happy about is that there is some consideration around the marketing, because we know that marketing plays a huge role in many of the things that entice our whānau in our communities, and what we wouldn't want to see is the ability for these products to be, on big, huge billboards such as what we see all around Auckland with alcohol. We don't want to normalise it, but what we want to do is protect those that might be requiring health services and Hauora services to help them navigate and journey through that dependence and that addiction.
This is a pretty tight regulation framework that's being proposed. It's closer to tobacco than it is alcohol, which is really, really good. And it was good to see that there's commitment to excise tax as well. The only kind of caution we'd put forward is that, this is essentially a commercial market. So there is provision for partnerships with community like iwi, and there was also provision for not-for-profit retail outlets. But it's only provision. So, a lot of this will come out in implementation. So we would like to see only not-for-profit retail outlets and community partnerships, so no big commercial international companies, because when you've got those companies, they're always going to be pushed back on the controls you've got. Our only other concerns are around potency. We think the potency cap 15% is too high, and we'd also like to see a commitment to a higher excess tax and the allowance for what we call cannabis social clubs. It's a not-for-profit. It means one person grows the cannabis for the whole club and then they just share the cannabis within the group. And the reason we're promoting that is because we think, the real key here is to stop the commercialisation and normalisation of cannabis use, as you say. And the best way to do that is keep for-profit companies out of the picture.
I believe included in the bill that no organisation will be able to own more than 20% of the overall quota. Is that a low enough threshold, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good provision, but our other concerns behind all this is how realistic some of these kind of proposals are going to be in terms of implementation, and how are they actually going to be enforced. So the other thing that we've talked about is the limit of 14 grams of purchase every day, which sounds like a good thing and a sensible thing, but we really question how that's actually going to be enforced. And also with home cultivation, are we going to have home inspections? Are people going to be licensed? Or, you can really see that's going to be a free-for-all. And in terms of the quotas, that's a really good provision, but again, we question how feasible some of these things are going to be.
So in the legalisation and control bill, you'll be able to grow 2 plants without a licence with a maximum of 4 plants overall in a household. What do you guys both think of that restriction on personal use? Is it too much, too little?
I don't hold a position on whether it's too much or too little, because it depends on, and I think Chris touched on it earlier, the potency.
How would you even monitor the potency of plants that people are growing in their household?
Yeah, exactly, and that's what Chris had said around, are they going to be doing house checks? And what we will know is, I'm a resident of Mangere. The police helicopter is forever frequenting the skies above my house every single night. Potentially those communities that are already burdened by many other significant harms will potentially be subjected to more checking than what we might see in our more affluent communities. And so we need to be really mindful that we have police discretion, and ensuring that the discretion that they use is without bias, is without judgment, and is from the outset some type of education program wrapped around and to support police when entering into homes, ensuring that it is done in the way in which we can support by way of a health approach if there is substance abuse or misuse within that whānau community.
Chris, are you aware of any increased police powers around the monitoring of growing marijuana in your own home?
it's really unclear how they would enforce any of the rules around cannabis cultivation at home, given that I think the minister came out at one stage and said, well, we're not going to have these home inspections or anything like that, which again, that's fine. That's probably, that's a good way to go. So ideally we want the people that are grown at home to appreciate the health risk of cannabis, even though it is legal for them to use it, but appreciate that there is some health risk, and be aware of how it affects their children that they're in their household, and making sure supply is secure. And all that happens by the individual appreciating those. It's probably not going to happen by the police kicking in the door. It's exactly what we don't want. And we've got to be, I think one of the other risks with all this is to make sure that we don't end up with more enforcement rather than less, because we've now got all this regulation. We've still got the underage provisions, and you may well getting the police even more enthusiastic about enforcement rather than what you really want to do is take it mostly away from criminal justice and make it mostly a health issue.
Just going back to our age restrictions, from a medical point of view, what effects does cannabis actually have on the young brain? Like, why is that age restriction so important?
Of the research we've got, one of the clear public health messages that's come out is that early onset use, so that's use in your very early adolescence, so 12 to 14 year olds, is really associated with high cannabis dependency and a whole lot of negative developmental outcomes, so like education, career, and even IQ in terms of how your brain develops. And those people are more likely to go on and use heavily and use daily and have a whole lot of problems later. So the real focus of reducing harm should be reducing that adolescent early onset use.
You used the word dependency. I thought cannabis was not addictive.
For a long time, people didn't talk much about cannabis dependency, but actually as we learn a bit more about how legal markets have been rolling out and have better survey data, probably about 20% of current users, so people that have used in the last year, would be defined using a validated scale as dependent. So the physical dependency is not what people might imagine, say with heroin and cocaine, but it still affects their lives in terms of, they have trouble stopping or cutting down, and they have a craving. And I think this is something people need to keep in mind, that the perception of the health risks of cannabis is just way too unrealistically low. But I'm not trying to say, on the other hand, that it is a really harmful thing. So this is getting the balance is really, really difficult in this debate. So best way to put it is it does have health risks, particularly if you're a daily or near daily user.
Yeah, we can sort of tag that to dependence on alcohol and tobacco as well, and usually we're speaking about the same members, individuals or whānau. What we want to ensure through whatever this may look like in October, now not September, is that, we strike the balance. It is a very hard one to call, because we have our, some nannies that have had to raise their grandchildren because of the incarceration rates of our Māori males being picked up for low-level drug offences. And so when we're trying to strike that balance, we're striking it from a place in which reduces harm from a health perspective, but also from a justice perspective. And that's something that has been really strong throughout the campaign of Health Not Handcuffs, the group led out by the New Zealand Drug Foundation that we have been working alongside, is to ensure that we are putting all the things in place, should it go to a yes in October, that is going to strike that balance. And if it's a no in October, then we will get the status quo. And what my concerns are around the status quo is that we have no control over the current market. We don't have a tax take that can support more investment into health services, social services, and then research that can wrap around to ensure that we get it right. I'll go back to Chris's point around the not-for-profit sector and partnership with iwi. We've got some iwi that are very strong in their position that it will be no for their iwi. They've seen too much harm, and so striking that balance around, if there are rohe within Aotearoa that are an absolute no, how are we going to ensure that the protective mechanisms of iwi partnership exist? How do we ensure that the government's going to be responsible to their treaty responsibilities? And so, you don't know where we're going to go, and we've got to make sure that the execution of whatever it is that we land on is done in the right way.
Yeah,
Who will be responsible for having those conversations with iwi, Selah? Is Hāpai te Hauora or the health collective that you're part of? I mean, are you guys in discussions with the government on iwi and whānau Māori equity around this?
Yep, so we were consulted as one of many parties that were consulted through the framework development and design. Where I think it fell short is, once again, a government organisation coming in and asking a couple of people their opinions, and then off they go and do what they were going to do anyway. One of the things that we had been really mindful of is the Cannabis Control Agency, or whatever the flash word is for this group that will be pulled together if it is a yes, to ensure that things are done right and in the right way. What I want to know, though, and it's, devil's in the detail, is what are the control mechanisms that group would have? Will there be an ensured response to Māori by Māori membership and decision making? And so I think that would be the right place, because it's, we can have the conversations right here, right now, and we already have been. We've been working to enact and enable both lots of information for our community so that they know going to the poll what they want to do. But at the end of the day, it comes down to how much of the decision-making and authority is given to that group, or the group of representatives that would act as the safeguard for all New Zealanders in that space.
I mean, our government, and not just our current government, but many prior governments are quite good at consulting with iwi Māori and then ignoring those recommendations. How do we push for that partnership?
The current legislation as it stands, I don't think really is strong enough. And I think that if we are going to go to that next stage, there would need to be, absolute partnership written black and white. It wouldn't just be a consultation group, because that's what we always know and see and have seen over many, many years, is that, we form the side group that has, the connections, the understandings, and the ways in which we can really get it right. And then their whakaaro is not taken on board, and we stick with the mainstream approach. And so I think that from the outset it needs to be a true reflection of a partnership and not just tokenistic.
Māori make up 41% of our cannabis-related offences over the last 5 years, and so we know that means that there are a lot of whānau Māori involved in the illegal growing and distribution of cannabis, which will, if this bill passes, will become a viable market for them. You've done a lot of research on the black market, Chris. Is it possible for those people who've been on the wrong side of the law all of this time to translate that into commercial success?
And this is one of the clearest benefits of legalisation, is in the criminal justice area. So Māori are disproportionately targeted in drug enforcement, and so are young men in general. And preventing them getting arrested and convictions can have really beneficial flow-on effects in terms of keeping them out of the criminal justice system. And, they're really important, particularly for Māori. And also keeping the black market out of Māori and deprived communities. So, tini houses that aren't in rich neighbourhoods, a real drag on those neighbourhoods, and also gangs to some extent, but also most of the drug market activity happens in those neighbourhoods. And that contributes to disadvantage. An additional part of the social equity approach would be to, first you could expunge all the convictions, which I think would be worth looking at. So people that have been convicted when they're 18 years old for like provision of cannabis or growing a few plants, I think you could really look at expunging those and taking away that conviction, so they don't have to continually talk about that when they go for a job or they want to go travelling or something like that. And the other part of the challenge is, supporting community providers who are, involved in the community, like iwi, and are going to use the money for some, community-based stuff like sports, culture, and arts. In terms of individual people, to some extent you can open it up for them to transition to the legal market. I'd put some caution over that, because sometimes I think people think that this is going to be a really boutique industry, that one person could come in and grow 10 plants and survive quite well in the market, where, if you look at the alcohol market and tobacco market, they're full of huge multinational companies who can produce those products at very low price. So if we look at overseas where they have had social equity, where they've tried to support affected communities to enter the market, the cannabis market, and also individuals. The problem for them is competing with these large commercial companies.
Are there any big commercial players that you're aware of that are already getting ready for the legalisation of cannabis?
Oh, definitely. So, a lot of these medicinal companies, cannabis companies, it's hard to see, given their level of investment they're putting into their production, that they're only interested in the medicinal market. So the medicinal market is going to be a pretty small part of the market, So I'm sure that in the long term they've got their eye on the recreational market, which is going to be much bigger. There's huge multinational Canadian companies now who can also come in and, they can grow their cannabis in, developing countries for a very low cost, and then just import it into New Zealand. So that's the real challenge in the long term, is controlling that.
Oh, I was aware that we can't export any cannabis products, but will we be able to import cannabis products under this bill?
Not at the moment, but the real danger here is over time that as the domestic market gets developed, there's going to be continued pushback, and you can see that in alcohol. The reason why you can't get alcohol out of supermarkets is because there's this huge alcohol lobby that's always continually pressurising back. And as public health researchers, we're always up against that. And, we're really small players in being able to compete against that. When you go to an alcohol licensing tribunal, the industry turns up with 6 lawyers and you're just one person. And that's the kind of, uneven playing field you end up with.
Selah, do you think that this bill is foolproof in terms of keeping people safe from the harmful effects of using cannabis?
What we do know is that policy usually never is good enough for our people, and that is the way in which that it is implemented. What we do, and the 20 odd people that I have to try and influence and change policy for the greater good of all of New Zealand, and also specifically for Māori and Pacific communities, is tiny in comparison to the multi-million-dollar companies that these people have. And, we have seen instances where we've been trying to make our points against issues in alcohol and tobacco. And he's right. Like, they turn up with lawyers, they have just this infrastructure that no one can compete with, especially in the very small funded market of public health in New Zealand. So I think that would be probably one of the biggest things, if it is a yes, is that we need to ensure that we don't allow big cannabis to come here. One thing I did want to go back to, and I'm not too sure if it is written in there, is around if someone had a conviction from a cannabis related offence, is there going to be a barrier for them then becoming a distributor or a retailer? And I'm not too sure, Chris, if that is in there, but I wanted to think about how we ensure that those that might have already had an historic clash with the law, that they would be enabled the opportunity to turn that into a business model. But what we also know is that, for many, starting a small business is hard enough to do with investment. So, we've got to also level that up in regards to how do we have an equitable approach for small business operation and setup.
So at the moment, the bill has really made a big effort to make it clear that people who have previously had a conviction for cultivation or use won't be excluded from getting licensed. So that's not a criteria to exclude anyone. So we think that's really good, and I think you can see quite clearly that they've had that in mind, and they don't want to exclude people. But as you rightly say, it's not easy setting up a small business. So that's going to take a lot of skills that those people might not necessarily had. So there's going to be need to support in terms of business schools. I guess we would much rather think it was more viable if you have a not-for-profit in a particular jurisdiction who has almost a monopoly. So they're sole licensed. So it might be an iwi, it might be an RSA type situation, or it might be a community trust. And with that monopoly, it allows them to compete quite well. And, the criteria for their license would be that they're really connected with the community in real ways. So, they might be supporting youth sport, they might be supporting cultural events, other community development.
Is there an opportunity for institutions like Massey University to offer education around starting small businesses in the cannabis sector?
I think universities could offer a number of skills and expertise. The real risk for universities is, what role do we want to play in this industry, or can we ethically play in this industry? I think with cannabis, it sounds a bit more benevolent, but if I said the same thing about tobacco, like we're going to, run courses for people to set up their own tobacco company, people would be, clearly pretty concerned about that. And same with alcohol. If we said we're going to run a whole lot of courses to allow the people to set up their own breweries in little towns. So, I think there's got to be a lot of caution about how the universities engage with this cannabis industry, because, I think we're still thinking about this thing as one guy with his 10 plants and this boutique kind of thing. Whereas really we're dealing with, in the next 5 or so years, we're going to be dealing with companies as large as tobacco and alcohol companies. So there's got to be a lot of care about, what are going to be the ethical guidelines about engagement.
I want to be clear about, I guess, what the risk of harm is. So we've talked about the effects on the young developing brain. If you are an adult over the age of 20 years, if you're consuming it in a way that's not smoking, so through edibles or vaping, what are the actual health risks?
People often ask, well, is it more or less harmful than alcohol, tobacco? I think you can't look at it because it's comparing apples and oranges. So the real important things about using all those substances is a number of things like frequency of use, what strength of those substances you're using, and something about you as a person. For cannabis, that's quite important. So even if you are over 20, but if you've got a history of mental illness, you're a very at-risk person, or a history of schizophrenia, or you've already got an alcohol and drug dependency, you're also one of those at-risk populations. But overall, I think that cannabis is it's definitely in the ballpark of alcohol use, probably a little less than alcohol use, and definitely a lot less than tobacco. So I think it is, as I said, I think it's viable to talk about legalising cannabis without a major worry about a huge increase in health risk. Most people, even daily users, can use cannabis at that level and not have any problems.
Selah, from a health research and advocacy point of view, do you agree that cannabis is as much a risk to health and mental health?
What we are 20 years behind where we need to be, because there's a huge methamphetamine epidemic right here, right now, and has been here for quite some time. And so this is one step, I think, in addressing something that has been sort of swept under the carpets for quite some time. What I do understand and what I don't want to see is that these products become normalised to our kids, and that's what we've seen with alcohol and tobacco, is that, they're inside the supermarkets, they're next to the bread and milk. We need to really think about how we don't encourage intergenerational harms from wherever we land in October with this. I think that there is still a lot more work that needs to be done in regards to consultation with those parties most affected, being Māori, Pacific, male, youth, and those with mental health and addiction issues already pending with them.
I want to talk briefly about tax. So currently in the bill there will be a higher excise tax on higher potency products, and then a levy on top of that. And then that will be put towards harm reduction programs and drug education. Do you think that's a good use of that tax?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the areas that we struggle with immensely is having the right balance of resourcing to actually get out and make a difference to public. One thing that we, again, this is a two-sided conversation, because we know that tax significantly can impact the weekly budget for whānau who don't have much to stretch within the 7 days anyway. So we need to be really mindful of what is going to happen with that tax taken, how we really get it to where it needs to be. Because what we know with tobacco is that there's a huge excise tax. It increases every year, although that stopped, that was the final part of that cycle this year. And yet the tobacco control sector get a minuscule amount to actually try and tackle the beast of addiction.
I would really agree with that. And the tax really has to be tied to prevention and treatment much more clearly than it is with alcohol, for example. So a high tax to us is really important, because our experience with alcohol and tobacco is the most price-sensitive people are young people and heavily dependent people, because they spend most of their income on alcohol, tobacco. So the high price is the most effective lever you can pull in terms of reducing consumption and heavy consumption, particularly by young people.
Is that verified? Because I feel like the high price of cigarettes these days, there's a lot of people, it hasn't prevented them from buying cigarettes.
It's been fairly effective in terms of reducing use over time. And also in terms of reducing youth use, so youth uptake of tobacco. I mean, there's always people that are going to try and purchase at higher price, but the higher the price, the less likely you are going to see it as a viable behaviour.
So we obviously hold the National Tobacco Advocacy Service, and so what we see, we came out from the outset when this the tax increases for tobacco were put into effect. We came in support, and the reason why is to try and keep the price high so that we keep it out of the hands of our rangatahi and those that have not smoked before. What I really want to stress here is that it needs to be tied specifically to the prevention, education and clinical services that are required for these people, because what we currently see is it goes into the black hole and it never comes out the other side. So, we need to make sure that it is used in the right way so that it is going to benefit those people. And if we've got a not-for-profit approach, potentially those that have that license for that rohe or that region could also be delivering on the other side a social response to that as well. I think that there is, you could potentially do that, whereas when you're entering into a commercial institute, they really probably don't give two about, your health and well-being, whereas if you've got it placed in a space that actually cares about the people that they're interacting with, then there might be a better way in which we can see the system working for our people.
So just to summarise our conversation that we have had, we are advocating for a not-for-profit system.
Yes. Yep.
And that greater education around responsibility, around use and buying.
Prevention, but also for young people, provision of things for them to do other than alcohol and drugs. So community, cultural, sport. To me, that's the best prevention.
Kia ora. Selah, what do you think has been your sort of main message that you want to get across today?
Well, I think that everyone needs to have the opportunity to weigh up both sides. That's where we need to be really ensuring of sharing both pros and cons, what we think is, the most positive parts of this, the most negative parts of that, and then giving the mana motuhake to those people to make their own decision and make their own call based on their own values, what that means for them and their whānau.
Kia ora. Tēnā kōrua to Selah and Chris, and to you for listening to this episode of Conversations That Count, ngā kōrero whaitake. Now, if you're looking for more information before you place your vote in October, check out Cannabis Convo, an online tool that's been designed to help voters get involved in the referendum. You can weigh up issues that are important to you, identify the approach that aligns with your values, and it also allows you to see how other people feel about the cannabis reform too. Cannabis Convo is brought to you by Massey University's Design and Democracy Project, Shaw and Whāriki and Effect. Head to cannabisconvo.co.nz to check it out. Now, Stacey Morrison will be back for the next episode. Until then, hei kōnei. You've been listening to Conversations That Count, ngā kōrero whaitake, brought to you by Massey University and The Spin-Off. Hosted by me, Leonie Hayden, produced by Jane Yee and Matthew McCauley, with music by Grayson Gilmore.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.